I'm Jonathan Scott. I'm currently a postdoc at UC Berkeley in the Energy Institute at Haas. In the interest of time today, I'm only going to be presenting one part of the paper listed in your agenda. So this paper discusses the preferences involved in a vehicle arms race. So the scenario of a vehicle arms race is where consumers with high preferences for safety tend to purchase larger vehicles because they're internalizing a vehicle size as a potential safety attribute. So they're purchasing larger and larger cars to protect themselves from other vehicles on the road. So this paper, whereas most of the previous literature has focused on the social costs, the external cost of an arms race, it's going to focus more on the types of preferences that could drive this behavior. All right, so the size of vehicles in terms of weight has actually been increasing steadily over time, even in the presence of CAFE standards. So the NHTSA estimates that the vehicle size of passenger cars have increased by about 13% in vehicle size since the 1980s, and light trucks by about 26%. So there's several implications for this, and this could be driven by multiple factors. I'm going to look at some of the preferences that could be driving this type of behavior. All right, so some of the potential implications of this growing weight of vehicle sizes in the country. So there's obviously a strong negative relationship between the size of vehicle and the fuel efficiency of that vehicle. A heavier vehicle fleet consumes more fossil fuels and emits higher levels of carbon pollution. And these are really important factors. The focus on this talk is what's called the arms race externality. So the heavier a vehicle, the more dangerous it is when involved in a vehicle accident. So for example, Bento, Gillingham, and Roth demonstrate that a heavier average vehicle size has led to more fatalities. And Anderson and Offhammer has actually dollarized this external cost. So they place the external cost of vehicle size on fatalities at about $136 billion a year. So this is an estimate that actually exceeds the annual social cost of carbon emissions. All right, so this paper is most closely linked to Anderson and Offhammer's restud paper. So they look at this external cost of vehicle size and actually try to estimate it. So their main estimate places the increase in probability of fatality in a two-car collision from a 47% increase in vehicle size. On the other end, larger vehicles actually serve as more protection. So their secondary estimates show that a 1,000-pound increase in vehicle size actually reduces this cost by about 25%. So my probability of fatality is actually reduced whenever I increase my size. An important conclusion from these two estimates is that the amount of protection from increasing my vehicle size is less than the increase in propensity of dying in an accident when other people increase their vehicle size. And that's just because this 47% is much larger than that increased protection of 25%. So Bento, Gillingham, and Roth actually confirm these estimates by estimating the impact of average vehicle sizes over time. And this paper more focuses on the extent to which consumers are internalizing these facts found in Anderson and Offhammer. And the extent to which they internalize these attributes of vehicle size dictates the existence of a vehicle arms race. And this is what I'm going to test for in this paper. All right, so the vehicle arms race has built a lot of media attention as a potential mechanism driving these increased dynamic preferences for vehicle size. So a New York Times article in 2016 quoted consumers in this about their preferences for safety. And one of the consumers said, "I'm sure the world would be a better place if we all drove minis, but with so many crazy drivers on the road, I want the biggest vehicle I can get." So this is kind of anecdotal evidence of these preferences for safety leading to an increased demand for large vehicles. And this is what I'm going to attempt to empirically test in a quasi-random manner in this paper. All right, so my specific research question for this part of the paper is whether consumers internalize pounds as a safety attribute. All right, so there's several complications with estimating this. So you would think the easiest method of testing for this is to go out and survey consumers on their preferences for safety and then observe their purchases in terms of increased vehicle size, whether they're buying SUVs or small sedans. But there's several problems with doing that. These preferences for safety might be correlated with other attributes of those consumers that also increase their demand for large vehicles, such as income levels. So in an ideal experiment, I would just be able to randomly assign preferences for vehicle size. That way they're not correlated with other attributes of those consumers, and then observe their take-up of large vehicles afterwards. So obviously, this type of experiment is not feasible in practice. In the data, it's also very difficult because these preferences are not directly observed. Only they're revealed preferences. And also, preferences tend to be, or at least we assume that they're static over time. So my solution in this paper is to isolate a shock that's going to shift these preferences for safety. And specifically, I'm going to look at acquaintances of these consumers and the death of those acquaintances in a vehicle accident and observe how that changes these households' behavior afterwards. These acquaintances I'm going to proxy by next door neighbors because I don't directly observe their network. And then this way I have this quasi-random shift in preferences for safety, and I'm going to see how they respond in terms of vehicle size purchases. Okay, so it's kind of the theory behind this. So consumers might have utility for pounds, preferences for large vehicles, for at least two potential reasons. They might have utility of safety that's going to be a function of the weight of the vehicle. And they also might prefer pounds because of the capacity they provide. I just like bigger vehicles and more room. Now, I want to isolate a shock that's going to shift the utility of safety, but is not going to be correlated with this capacity. So the way this neighbor's fatality works is ex ante, I'm going to expect this to either shift their preferences directly or shift their beliefs about their propensity of actually dying in a smaller vehicle. This way, I don't expect neighbor's fatality to be correlated with their preferences for capacity, and I'll be able to isolate these preferences for safety. Okay, so punchline. This is the figure in the paper that kind of just explains it all. So this figure looks at the treatment and control group. So my treatment group in this paper is the neighbors of crash victims that die in the accidents. And then my control group, which I expect to be really similar in behavior to the treatment group, are neighbors of people still involved in these car crashes, but like who survive it. And as you can see, so on the y-axis is normalized to 0 household vehicle size and weight in pounds. And the treatment and control group's behavior track each other really well in the pre-period. Then following the car crash, I see a diversion. I see an increase in vehicle size by the treatment group. And this ultimately gets to about 60 pounds on average for a household. All right, so I'm exploiting this type of variation that apparently makes vehicle weight salient to these consumers, where I observe households responding by purchasing significantly larger vehicle given the shock to their preference for safety. So putting this into words you can understand, these estimates suggest that a neighbor's fatality causes about 1 out of 7 neighbors to go from a small sedan like a Honda Accord to a midsize SUV such as a Jeep Cherokee. Okay, so the arms race mechanism also suggests that if consumers are internalizing vehicle weight as a safety attribute, then they should also consider the size of vehicles around them. All right. So, for example, if this utility of safety is parameterized according to the consumer's belief about the probability of dying in an accident, you would suspect that they would condition this not only on the vehicle size of the car they're driving, but also the vehicle size of the cars that they tend to drive around. So in this part of the paper, I'm going to look at this interaction effect of the county average vehicle size. So if this mechanism truly exists, then we would expect any shift in the average size of the vehicles around them to increase the treatment effect of a neighbor's fatality. So this graph plots actual estimates of the treatment effect before the car crash, which we should expect 0 effect, and afterwards for 2 different samples. This splits up the entire data up into a heavy county sample and a light county sample. And as you can see, for the heavy county, these effects of the neighbor's fatality in a car crash are substantially larger, and they tend to persist. Whereas the light county, eventually they start dropping off. So this indicates the possibility of them re-updating their beliefs afterwards and going back to their original beliefs about their propensity to die in an accident. So these estimates suggest that an additional 15-pound increase, an additional increase of 15 pounds following a neighbor's fatality for each 100-pound increase in county mean weight. So I'm not going to get into the simple heterogeneity. I do a lot of robustness checks to hint at this is not necessarily a heterogeneous effect, that I expect this to actually be a response to the mean weights in their county and a direct response from these consumers. Okay, so I'm going to sum up. All right, so this work documents the impact of preferences for safety on the demand for large vehicles. I provide quasi-experimental evidence that a shift in preferences for safety increased demand for bigger cars. And this illustrates an additional private benefit that these consumers receive from larger cars. However, purchasing larger cars in a vehicle arms race leads to these inefficient outcomes. This produces a prisoner's dilemma where now consumers, best responding to each other, increase the overall risk on the road, putting drivers at a higher risk. Okay, that's it. Thank you.